The night was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into bones and lingered like an uninvited guest. Snowflakes drifted lazily past the grand windows of a mansion, their silent dance illuminated by the pale glow of porch lights. Inside, a man sat motionless in a wheelchair, his gaze fixed on the winter landscape beyond the glass. His name was Robert Harrison, a man who had once commanded boardrooms, whose laughter had once filled these very halls. But that was before the accident, before the world forgot him. 20 years had passed since the crash that stole his ability to walk, and with it, the life he'd known. Friends had faded like old photographs. Even his wife, Diana, had left, unable to bear the weight of his bitterness. Now the mansion stood as a monument to his isolation, its opulence mocking him with every hollow echo of his footsteps, or rather, the absence of them. Then a sound, a soft knock at the door, so faint it could have been the wind. But it came again, persistent, like a heartbeat refusing to be ignored. Robert hesitated. No one visited him anymore, especially not at this hour. Yet something, curiosity perhaps, or the ghost of a hope he'd long buried, made him wheel toward the door. When he opened it, he found a child, a little girl no older than 6, her dark skin flushed from the cold, her clothes worn thin. Her eyes, though, her eyes were alive, bright with a light Robert hadn't seen in years. "I'm hungry," she said simply. No pity in her voice, no fear, just truth. Robert could have turned her away. He could have clung to the numbness that had been his companion for decades. But in that moment, something shifted. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, not at his wheelchair, not at his wealth, but at him. Or maybe it was the strange, impossible words she spoke next. "I can make you walk again." He laughed. Of course he laughed. But as the door closed behind her, as the warmth of her presence seeped into the cracks of his frozen heart, Robert Harrison felt something he thought he'd lost forever. Hope. The little girl's name was Jasmine. She lived with her mother, Margaret, in a cramped apartment across the street. A world Robert had never noticed, though it stood right outside his gates. While his mansion was filled with silence, their home was filled with struggle. Margaret worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table, leaving Jasmine to fend for herself on those long, lonely nights. That first evening, as Robert watched Jasmine eat the leftovers he'd given her, something inside him stirred. She didn't devour the food like a starving child might. Instead, she ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it were a gift. And then, with a quiet certainty that belied her age, she looked up at him and said, "Now it's my turn to help you." Robert had spent years drowning in cynicism. He'd consulted the best doctors, tried every experimental treatment, only to be told the same thing. "You'll never walk again." So when this child, this tiny, threadbare miracle, placed her small hand on his knee and whispered, "Believe," he should have scoffed. He should have sent her home. But he didn't. Maybe it was the way her fingers seemed to radiate warmth, seeping through the numbness of his legs. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, not with pity, but with a conviction so pure it shook him. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the faintest flicker of feeling, a twitch, a spark, where for 20 years there had been nothing. When Jasmine left that night, she pressed a single flower into Robert's palm, a daisy, its petals slightly crumpled from being carried in her small fist. "This is the first miracle," she said, "the miracle of not being alone." And for the first time in 2 decades, Robert Harrison wept. The next morning, Robert woke to an unfamiliar sensation. Not pain, not numbness, but something fluttering beneath his skin like a trapped bird. He stared at his legs, half expecting the feeling to vanish. But it remained, faint yet undeniable. When his housekeeper Sophia arrived, he told her about Jasmine, expecting her to share his cautious hope. Instead, her face darkened. "That child's playing tricks on you," she warned. "People like them always want something." The words hung in the air, sharp as broken glass. Robert had heard that tone before, the quiet disdain of those who believed poverty and skin color defined a person's worth. But the memory of Jasmine's hands, small and warm against his lifeless legs, silenced his doubts. She returned that afternoon, this time with her mother. Margaret stood in his doorway like a storm cloud, protective, wary, her eyes scanning the room for hidden threats. Robert understood. The world had not been kind to women like her. But when Jasmine darted forward to hug him, Margaret's stern expression faltered. She watched, breath held, as her daughter placed both hands on Robert's knees and closed her eyes in fierce concentration. "Mama says miracles need 3 things," Jasmine announced. "Love, faith, and a little bit of stubborn." Margaret's laugh was startled, bright, a sound that seemed to startle them all. And in that moment something unspoken passed between her and Robert. A truce, a thread of trust spun from the quiet understanding of two people who had been broken by the world and were beginning to believe it might still offer gifts. That night, as Robert lay in bed, his legs tingled. Not with pain, but with possibility. Down the hall, Jasmine slept curled against her mother, their whispers weaving through the dark. "Do you really think he'll walk again?" Margaret murmured. Jasmine's answer was a promise, a prayer. "He already is." The days that followed were filled with small rebellions against the impossible. Each morning, Jasmine arrived with her pockets full of treasures, a smooth stone, a feather, a crumpled drawing. Each one, she claimed, carried its own kind of magic. "This one's for courage," she'd say, pressing a dandelion into Robert's palm. "And this one's for remembering how to laugh." She'd place her hands on his legs, her touch light as sunlight, and hum songs her mother had taught her. Songs about hope that could outlast the longest night. Robert's physical therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Vargas, nearly dropped her clipboard during their next session when his left foot jerked involuntarily. "That's not supposed to happen," she muttered, running tests with shaking hands. The numbers didn't lie. Dormant nerves were flickering awake, like stars winking into existence one by one. When she demanded an explanation, Robert simply nodded toward Jasmine, who was spinning in circles with her arms outstretched, her laughter painting the sterile clinic walls gold. But outside that fragile circle of hope, the world remained cruel. Neighbors whispered behind cupped hands when Margaret walked Jasmine to school. Old acquaintances crossed the street to avoid Robert, their stares screaming the question they dared not ask aloud. How could you choose them? Even Sophia's loyalty curdled into something bitter. She began leaving newspaper clippings on Robert's desk, stories of scams, of opportunists preying on the vulnerable. The breaking point came on a rain-lashed Tuesday. Robert, emboldened by weeks of progress, attempted to stand without his wheelchair during Jasmine's visit. His legs trembled, then held, for 3 glorious seconds, before buckling. Margaret caught him, her arms strong around his waist, their faces inches apart. In that heartbeat of stillness, something shifted, not just in his muscles, but in the space between them. A recognition, a promise. Jasmine clapped her hands, rain dripping from her curls. "See," she crowed, "you just needed someone to catch you." That night, Robert dreamed of walking, not the stiff, mechanical steps of his physical therapy, but running, wild and unfettered, through a field where Jasmine's laughter bloomed like flowers underfoot. When he woke, his pillow was damp with tears, not of grief, but of gratitude. The miracle wasn't just in his legs. It was in the way Margaret's hand lingered when she helped him up. It was in Jasmine teaching him to see magic in crumpled weeds and cracked sidewalks. It was in the terrifying, exhilarating realization that after 20 years of building walls, he'd finally found a reason to tear them down. The whispers in town grew louder, twisting into something darker. Anonymous letters began arriving at the mansion. "They're using you," scrawled in jagged handwriting. "That child is a con artist," slipped under the door. Even Robert's ex-wife Diana reappeared, her designer heels clicking like accusations across his marble floors. "You're being manipulated," she hissed, her perfume suddenly suffocating. "That woman and her daughter are parasites." Robert's hands clenched around the arms of his wheelchair. The old him, the bitter, broken man, would have believed her. But then he remembered Jasmine's small hands pressing warmth into his legs, Margaret staying up late to research nerve regeneration studies, the way their laughter had begun to fill the hollow spaces of his home. One icy morning, the confrontation came. A reporter ambushed them outside the clinic, shoving a microphone in Margaret's face. "Is it true you're exploiting Mr. Harrison's condition for financial gain?" Margaret stiffened, her arm tightening around Jasmine, but before she could speak, Robert did something extraordinary. He stood, not perfectly, not without swaying, but upright, his legs shaking but holding as he stepped between his family and the camera. The reporter stumbled back, nearly dropping his equipment. "The only exploitation here," Robert said, his voice steady as stone, "is your assumption that kindness can't exist without an ulterior motive." Behind him, Jasmine beamed like the sun breaking through storm clouds. That night, as Margaret helped him stretch his protesting muscles, she asked the question that had been burning in her eyes for weeks. "Why us? You could have hired the best nurses, the most expensive specialists. Why risk everything for a stranger and her daughter?" Robert looked at Jasmine asleep on the couch, her fingers still curled around the daisy she'd picked for him that afternoon. "Because," he said quietly, "you were the only ones who saw me instead of my chair." The next day, three things happened. Robert took 12 unassisted steps. Margaret received a job offer from the clinic that had once turned her away. And Jasmine, with the solemnity of a queen bestowing knighthood, placed an acorn cap on Robert's head and declared him officially part of the Miracle Club. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Prejudice doesn't vanish overnight, and bodies heal slower than hearts. But as the first crocuses pushed through the snow outside the mansion, something else became undeniable. Winter was ending. The spring morning of Robert's final physical therapy evaluation dawned bright and clear. Outside the clinic windows, cherry blossoms swirled through the air like confetti. Jasmine clutched Margaret's hand, her other fist stuffed with magic pebbles she'd collected specially for the occasion. Even Eleanor Harrison stood stiffly in the corner, her designer handbag trembling slightly against her side. Dr. Vargas attached the final sensor to Robert's leg with clinical precision, but her fingers betrayed her. They shook. The machine beeped to life, its screen flashing numbers that made her suck in a sharp breath. "Medically impossible," she whispered. Then Robert stood. Not the careful, supported rise of previous attempts, not the trembling half-steps clinging to parallel bars. He simply stood, like a man waking from a long dream, like a tree remembering how to sway. Jasmine's pebbles clattered to the floor. One step, then another. Then he walked, not the mechanical march of a rehab patient. He walked, past the stunned doctors, past Eleanor's silent tears, straight to Margaret and Jasmine. When his knees buckled, it wasn't from weakness. It was from the weight of the moment as he pulled them into an embrace, his face buried in Margaret's hair, Jasmine's delighted squeal ringing in his ears. Later, when reporters demanded answers, Robert would say only this: "The miracle wasn't in my legs. It was in a child who taught me that sometimes you have to believe in the impossible to make it possible." And when the cameras turned to Jasmine, asked how she'd accomplished what teams of doctors couldn't, she just grinned and held up a fistful of wilted dandelions. "Easy," she said. "You just have to give the magic somewhere to live." The story spread. not as a medical mystery, but as something far more dangerous to the status quo. Proof that love could rebuild what the world said was broken forever. Neighbors who'd crossed the street now left casseroles on the mansion's steps. The clinic hired Margaret as their first community outreach director. And on Jasmine's 7th birthday, when Robert danced with her in the garden, his steps clumsy but full of joy, even the cherry blossoms seemed to swirl brighter. As the sun set that day, painting the sky in triumphant oranges and pinks, Robert realized the wheelchair gathering dust in the corner was no longer a prison. It was simply a chair, and the family laughing around him. That was the miracle. So tell me, when was the last time you believed in something impossible? Drop a comment below and don't forget to subscribe, because the world, it needs more stories like this.